All right, welcome everyone to another installment of our play series. Tonight we're switching to Shakespeare. As you probably have heard before, we are doing these mini trilogies. So we'll do 3 plays by Shakespeare, and then we'll move on to more modern plays. So tonight we are doing King Lear, a truly celebrated play. It's hard to pick a favorite with Shakespeare, obviously, but this is definitely a huge favorite of many. I like it more and more every time I reread it. So let me put it this way: it wasn't my favorite initially, but every time I reread it, I'm amazed at the depth and mastery of Shakespeare in crafting it. And one of the things that is really stood out to me. I actually read this play in college as part of our humanities course, and one of the things the professor did is he asked us to do word studies in this play, basically pick out some word that we thought was important to the play, to the themes, and then we would go to the Oxford English Dictionary, which of course has the etymologies and the histories of usage going back to, like, I don't know, 1200s or something like that. And we did word studies on this, and it still stuck with me. I did word study on related words, doting and dotage. Not really used that much today, but still in use sometimes. Doting, of course, has the meaning of someone who is interested or emotionally attracted or just attracted to someone. And then dotage has that connotation as well, but also has another meaning, which is old age and senility and all the infirmities and limitations that go with that. So of course Shakespeare plays on the two meanings of the two words, and it's very interesting to trace the usage of the two. You can actually see one of I guess a good example of that in Kent's reply to the king when Kent hides his identity, and the king asks him how old he is. He says, "I'm not so young as to love a woman for singing, but not so old to dote on her for anything." And again, the context of the old age and this double meaning of doting is implied, as well as this word is used in relation to King Lear and his favorite daughter, Cornelia, favorite before Act 1, Scene 1. But anyway, that's the kind of my opening salvo here. So King Lear, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with it, but I'll just go through the quick synopsis of the play, just so we're all on the same page. The setting is, you have this king of Britain, King Lear. He's getting old. He wants to divide up his kingdom between his 3 daughters who are getting married or are already betrothed to be married. And he has an interesting test for them. He asks them how much they love him. And so it's basically a test of eloquence, but he thinks it's a test of love. And so that's the first kind of setup that we have. And the 2 of them are very eloquent, and they assure the king of their eternal affection. And the 3rd one is more plain Jane, Cordelia, who just says, "Look, I have the type of, I love you as much as I should love you." And that's about it. That's all I can say. So the king is not happy with that. He divests her of her portion of the inheritance, apportions it between the 2 daughters who are more outspoken, and that sets up the chain of events that follows, which is obviously very tragic and dramatic in every way. King Lear is, he expels his daughter that doesn't profess her love to him. She goes off with her husband, the King of France. The other 2 daughters become his mainstay, and they eventually expel him. Their love is not as deep as what they profess it to be. And so that's one kind of plot line. The other plot line that happens in parallel is another. We have another father figure, and another case of unwise or lack, I guess, unwise decision making or lack of perspicuity, or whatever you want to call it. It's Gloucester and his two sons, Edmund and Edgar. Or Edgar, rather, is his legitimate son, and Edmund is his illegitimate son. And Edmund, rather, is the one that is the plotting one, the conniving one, and he plots against his half-brother to gain the upper hand in inheritance. And so you have this second parallel storyline. The two obviously collide and intertwine. The result is that the house of Lear is destroyed towards the end. Lear dies, all of his daughters die, and we have the kind of the very sad finish line there. Now that's the basic plot line, but I guess what makes this play stand out are the both the philosophical underpinnings of it, the kind of the examination of human nature, and the questions of wisdom, sagacity, old age, succession, obviously relations in the family, as was a sore subject or a point of contention in European history, as we all know. That was, it was a sore point because succession was fought over, and we do have a lot of instances of brothers killing brothers, poisonings, and so on. So this is completely within the realm of possibility. Something like this could definitely happen. What I'm curious about is kind of the initial setup of this. It always puzzled me how someone could be so short-sighted to apportion their kingdom based on, again, this sort of test of eloquence. And in fact, it's pretty apparent to everyone except for Lear, mistake, even to his own daughters, which is ironic. His own daughters, especially the two that are not true to themselves, are the kind of these serpents in disguise, the Goneril and Regan. They themselves say Dad has really overreached here. He's not a good judge of character. I mean, they come out and say it right there in Act 1, Scene 1. And so they know something is up. His trusted servant, Kent, also contradicts the king and directs King's ire against him. And he says, look, I don't care if you kill me, you're making a big mistake. So everyone seems to know it except for King Lear. And of course, this is that tension that we talked about in Medea, in Euripides, where you kind of know that something is wrong, and you want to tell, you want to shout, and you want to reach out to that main character, the main protagonist, and say, look, come on, listen to reason. And you know something bad is going to happen. And this sets up this tension that is, follows you throughout the play and makes you want to read on to see how exactly it's going to turn out, right? So this is the genius of Shakespeare in setting up all of these plot lines. Another thing that is truly, I would say, seminal about this play is the depiction of nature, the tempest in the heath in Britain. That I don't know if, and Doug, maybe you can correct me, but I don't know if has anyone used this in literature before, the forces of nature in this way, to sort of portray what's happening in a person's mind, a person's kind of inner psychology. I would be curious to know if that was done before Shakespeare. But this, to me, is even if it was done before, this is definitely one of those great moments in literature where a device like this is used, and it is so phenomenal. We have this scene where Lear is expelled finally by both of his daughters, and he has no place to stay, and he's wandering through this tempest. And the tempest and the description of kind of this upheaval in nature is a mirror of what's happening in his own mind and his own heart. He's losing his mind, basically, is what's happening. If he hasn't lost it before, he has probably lost his ability to, or his sagacity and his kind of wisdom a while back, but now he's losing just the basic sanity of mind. And what's happening in nature, it's this chaos, upheaval, and Lear at times calls on nature to sort of complete this destructive cycle and mix up everything, mix up the land and the sea and the wind, and it's very powerful and disturbing. And then, of course, Lear comes out with this kind of very strange garb. Shakespeare doesn't really go into details. You see illustrations of that. He has like leaves and roots of plants and so on in his flowing hair. It almost looks like Bacchus, Dionysus at that point, which probably is not far off, because Dionysus, of course, is associated with loss of reason, right? So anyway, it's a very dramatic, very beautifully set play. The other thing that I guess sets it apart is there's so many great lines from it that come out of this play. I mean, as you read it, I started jotting down some of them, but it's impossible. I stopped because it's just too many. You have to copy the entire play. There's just so many great lines and great monologues from start to finish. So yeah, if you have a great line or favorite of yours, I like. I mean, again, there's so many I can quote, like a bunch of them. One that I like particularly is sometimes gestures are prophets. This is what Regan says as Goneril, her sisters, make. And she says, gestures are sometimes prophets. And of course, this is a throwback to the role that the fool plays in the play. King Lear's fool is a really interesting character, just completely set apart from all the others. And you have this interesting kind of you have this constant back and forth between sanity and madness, joking and reality. So and also vision and blindness, both literal and metaphorical. So Lear is obviously blind metaphorically to the real character of his daughters, people that are closest to him, which is again very ironic. Gloucester is blind to the reality of who, where the loyalties of his sons are. And then finally, he is actually blinded physically. It's kind of the last, the realization of his blindness becomes complete. He is blinded physically. And then you have the Joker, who pretends to be king and is actually wiser than the king, and the king becomes a joke, right? So you have this amazing reversal of roles with those two characters. So there's just so many different dimensions that you could look at with this play. I'm going to stop here because I can probably ramble for another couple of minutes here, but I'll pass the mic to Doug. Doug, I'm sure you can add a few words and maybe tell us a little bit about the plays you've seen, maybe some notable instances of the making of plays based on King Lear, and maybe some notes there.
Yes, it's an interesting play in the sense that I think I maybe first read it in a special World Lit summer high school class, and it's so complex at that age. And then I think I studied in at least one college university class, English department, Shakespeare, maybe two. I had two different, and then but the play, and then I read it once to maybe produce it, and then but I have to say the play I couldn't really tackle the play or really grab the play. I liked the play, but it was so complex and level that it's only when I kind of left the theater I'd founded and ran for 20 years and sort of left my own kingdom that I suddenly realized how simple the play is. That when you walk away from your power in that sense, a social power, like running a theater company, and where you often have 500 friends who want to be cast and do shows, and then you kind of have 12 friends who are kind of hanging out with you when you're no longer offering jobs. But I then directed it with my wife at the time with junior high school girls, 8 junior high school girls, and we did a 50-minute, hour-long King Lear. And it was really remarkable to work on that. It was a 1 hour version, and in a lot of ways, it's a fairy tale play. It's a king with his three daughters, and it's like Pantalone combined with kind of a braggart soldier in the Commedia dell'arte tradition, with these three daughters, Columbine figures, who all drive him crazy in one way or another. And then there are a lot of clever servants all around, and there are a lot of the stereotypes. So there's sort of a commedia element to the play, uh, and so it suddenly things about it just became ring crystal clear, and a certain spiritual mystical thing that this is like the word nothing shows up right in the beginning. Cordelia says, he says, "What do you have to say?" And she says, "Nothing." He goes, "Well, nothing comes from nothing." And the play on nothing throughout the play is very interesting. I liked what you brought up, that he shows up with these flowers in his hair, and it's almost like it's Bacchus, but it's also like a May maiden or something. The maiden in the woods who's wearing flowers in her,
Like a nymph.
yeah, the flowers in her hair, kind of almost flower child thing that he becomes. And there's this ultimate power. But there's one point where I began to make sense of it, uh, where you have to realize he's really a military figure. And so I always thought, there are these great actors who play him, like Olivier has played him, and he was very old. And my Shakespeare teacher actually thought you had to be no older than 40 years old to have the energy to play Lear. That somebody, although I saw Glenda Jackson do it a few years ago in New York, and she was astonishing, her ability to just stand and deliver that role. And I think her years in Parliament gave her some sense of how to deal with the
Hmm.
power elements in the play. So that was, I think, the best Lear actually is the one that's not faithful to the play, which is Kurosawa's Ran, Aran, which is an incredible movie that captures the spirit of the piece. But Kozintsev, the Russian director, did a great version. He also did Hamlet. And Peter Brook did a great version with Paul Scofield, and he was very influenced by the Russian version when Peter Brook, the great British director, extremely influential his whole life in theater in England and around the world. I mean, uh, figures. So, and then Ingmar Bergman actually has a chapter of directing Lear, and the power goes out in the building, and the cast is just sort of hanging out, and then they realize it's going to be a long time. And so somebody lights some candles and somebody starts playing a guitar and singing songs, and they sort of start exploring the landscape of the play just improvisationally. It's a really beautiful chapter of Bergman, sort of this monster play colliding with a catastrophe. But I think another version that's in a way, I don't know that it's influenced directly by Lear, but I think the great Santini is a military figure who's very capable, who's a drunk and highly skilled and terrible father, almost a sadist as a father. And but his kids really love him and hate him at the same time. Uh, and so that kind of, and the storm and is important because a lot of people do the storm like this sort of intoning of poetry, but I think it's a military figure who is ordering the storm to cooperate with him. And he feels like he has more success doing that than ordering his daughters about. So it's a lot of military commands in the way he talks to the storm. I
Hmm.
mean, it's like a general, a great general who's gone mad, and he goes out, has no power. So he goes out into the middle of this great storm and starts shouting at it. And the thing you raise about nature is very important, because one of my teachers said Shakespeare is very skilled at making nature reflect the psychological state of a character. they're very happy and the sun's out, and then suddenly something terrible happens and the weather gets cloudy. And then there's the war between Titania and Oberon in Midsummer Night's Dream, which is almost like a climate change disaster of these warring gods creates a havoc, or fairies or gods or whatever. It creates a havoc in nature. Their battle creates a battle in nature. And that's an amazing speech. And it's like, it's kind of what's happening in the world right now is the fight. So, but I think there's an amazing comedy to the piece if you can capture it, and a terrible tragedy of the piece. And at some other point, I thought Regan, Goneril, Cordelia, and they're all older characters in a way. And so there's some point where I realized there's a lot of elements of like they're adult children of alcoholics, is what they are. And there's a sort of chaos that comes into the family because the dad is just an outrageous drunk who thinks bringing 100 knights to drink wildly through the night is okay when he's living with his daughters. I mean, he's just, and I just reread the first scene like this morning, and my God, the subtle cruelty in the language. But as you say, you have to read it and read it. And each time I read it, there's an energy in the language that just always astonishes me, and surprises me. So,
Yeah, I used to make this mistaken statement that I actually like Shakespeare more in translation. So we had this beautiful translation into Russian of Shakespeare, and that's where I grew up reading. That's how I learned Shakespeare initially, is reading that translation. I forget, it was either actually I think I know who it was, but anyway, it doesn't matter. It was a great. So then when I read the original, I was a little bit disappointed, and I thought, wait a second, this doesn't rhyme as well. But then when I read King Lear, and I started doing these word studies and pausing enough to look at the language, this is really where Shakespeare's brilliance comes out. And of course the translations lose that part. So if you're not reading the original, you don't get any of that at all, because English language, being what it is amazingly rich, and it has that history that Shakespeare picks up on, the Old English, the Middle English, and the King James English that he uses. It has even at that point, there's already a lot of these anachronistic terms, but he takes advantage of them, and he uses the older meanings and the newer meanings, and they're all they create this almost like translucent semantics, right, of the text. As you read, you're not sure, is he talking about old age, or is he talking about the rot of the old age, or is he talking about attraction, or is he talking about all of these? But it's probably all of them, because he had such a mastery of language. Yeah, about the nature too. I don't know, Doug, do you know of anyone who has done this before Shakespeare?
Well, as I mentioned in one presentation I did, the Greeks did it with the choruses, where some of the choruses, particularly in Euripides, I think, the Aeschylus and Sophocles, the chorus are often debating what's going on, whereas Euripides uses the chorus to talk about storms and floods and fires and disasters that reflect the emotional chaos of the lead character. So there is that, but it's a good question, and I think in maybe even the Psalms, storms have a
One, yes, absolutely.
quality.
Yes, there's definitely nature in Psalms. Yes, that's a great point.
And in the Bible, not generally, but certain books of the Bible, the
Yes.
storms or the nature, maybe even the Song of Songs. I'd have to go back and look at, and even the book of Job perhaps has some of
Oh yeah,
that.
for sure. Book of Job, yes. God speaking out of the
Nature's
whirlwind.
there. And so I imagine the medieval writers, and the songs of, traveling through a storm to find the light. It certainly becomes a cliche in songs. By the 19th century, there's some very famous songs about heading to the light through a storm.
And of course, this tradition is carried forward with Tolstoy and Gogol, the two probably great examples of that. With Tolstoy, he has this very long passage on this beautiful big oak that's growing in the middle of nowhere, and it's just this amazing 10-page description, I think, of this oak that is just absolutely blows you away. And then there's in Gogol, there's this personification of St. Petersburg as a type of actor in his stories and short stories and novels and so on. And of course, Dostoevsky uses the St. Petersburg as this like sick old man that is the background to everything. And you read about Raskolnikov, and that's the background, everything that's happening with those kind of like this typhoid yellow streets, the color of the street blocks, and Raskolnikov himself is sick. And anyway, so this idea of using nature and external world to parallel what's happening internally is definitely picked up later on. But Shakespeare uses it masterfully here, and it's something to read.
And
so
it was big with the romantics. Mary Shelley uses it a lot.
Mhm.
They go to the mountaintops and they're happy, but then suddenly there are clouds and storms and lightning and terror. And the Sturm und Drang is really the storm and stress is an inner reality and also reflected by nature.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great.
I like that you brought that up, and not just in the big storm, but in subtle other ways.
So I want to open this up to anyone else who wants to share. Oh, go ahead, Mike. Very quick on the draw.
Provocative statement was who gave up the throne. And the only one that really voluntarily gave up their throne and dissolved their kingdom is Diocletian in the Roman Empire. And he divided the kingdom and gave it to his best lieutenants. And that worked out well because it was in crisis, and he created individual fiefdoms that worked. When Hirohito gave up his throne, he had a gun at his back, but he gave up his throne, even though some of the people considered him the god who was going to rule forever, even after death. But it was really MacArthur said, I think, said, if you want to live, that's what you got to do. And he went on the radio and announced to his people, some of whom have never heard him speak, that he was going to give up his throne. But Diocletian is the only one that others. Stalin didn't give up his throne, and nobody else. I can't think of anybody else who really gave up their throne with the positive result that they wanted. Everybody died in King Lear, which is true about a lot of Shakespeare's plays. So that's the
Yeah, that's good. That's good observation. I wasn't thinking of necessarily giving up the power, but definitely that's part of this. Part of this play is Lear gives up the power, hoping that his sisters, his daughters, are going to be benevolent, but of course they are not.
He didn't do it to improve the kingdom. He did it for his own selfish reasons of furthering his legacy. And everybody died eventually because of his benevolent gift of giving up his throne.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Mike, for that. Anyone else wants to comment on King Lear? We'll just kind of keep this conversational, so there's no strict agenda. Just raise your hand or type an exclamation point in the chat. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I want to follow up on a comment about the Kurosawa movie Ran, which I absolutely loved years ago when I saw it. I was so ignorant of Shakespeare. I heard some little thing that it was somehow related to this King Lear, but I would just like to hear you guys talk a little bit about more, because I know that movie better than I know the play. And so just I'd love to hear you talk more about the relationship between the two. I'm struck by so many scenes in it, like when the sons go, like, Dad, of course we're gonna kill each other. We're your sons. That was that movie, right? And they go, it's that thing about not understanding they were raised as warriors, at least in that movie. So that's an example of a question I have. Is that a theme he took from King Lear, or did that he lay that on to get the culture of the Japanese era of that time? Or just some thoughts on that.
Doug, you're muted.
It's one of my favorite films, and I've watched it many times, but I haven't watched it for a while. I should go back and watch it again. He does change the daughters to sons. He goes more into the backstories of showing the power of battle and the horses and all of that, and the kind of that the power this man has, and then and he really makes it his own. I mean, he's not doing the play; he's doing the story in his own take on it. But the relationship of the fool and Lear is very amazing in that. The way the fool kind of runs away terrified at some point and disappears out of the story. It's I mean, Kurosawa also did the Scottish play. He did with Toshiro Mifune, The Throne of Blood. And so he definitely was influenced by Shakespeare in a dramatic sense. And apparently some Japanese thought he was too westernized in the theatricality of his movies. But he definitely, in many of his movies, his ability to capture the nature of battle, and I think a lot of American and British productions don't really capture, although the British now, I think in the last 30 years have done that more, where you get these guys who just look like they could be warriors on a battlefield. They're great British actors, but they look like they could wield a huge axe and cut your head off. And so I think that kind of physical power, and then the delicacy within that power and the fragility of that power, Shakespeare does that really well, and Lear, I think, personifies that more than anyone. And I think what he abdicates is responsibility. He says, I don't want the cares. You take care. You run the business, but you got to still treat me with all the respect I deserve, and it's like, really? We got to kowtow to your parties and everything whim you want to do, but you're not going to do anything to keep it going. You're not going to take the responsibility. It's amazing what he does in that first scene and what he says he's going to do. And
yeah, I want to pick up on that as well, because that always troubled me or bugged me. What do you think is the ultimate purpose in this sudden division of the kingdom? I mean, obviously Lear is still at that point able to do a lot. Why does he withdraw? What's the ultimate motive here?
Yeah. He says he wants to hand off the care and just kind of cruise towards death smoothly and lightly and easily. And he wants to be a party dude. It's that side of the Robert Duvall on The Great Santini captures those drunken parties where he's willing to insult anyone, where he's actually out in a park stumbling drunk in the dark, and his son is teasing him. He's trying to hit his son. It's almost like the way he battles his son in that scene in the park is like Lear in the Storm. I think The Great Santini is a great example of a terrific warrior who's just lost it, who's gone beyond his capability to be a human being in any consistent way.
Well, that's definitely a new light for me, because I know I haven't read it like that. And maybe because of the movie versus the book itself. Paul, did you want to comment back on that?
Yeah, on that same thing. I want to, again, it's like I'm sort of embarrassed to say I know the movie ran better than the Shakespeare play, but I got the impression in the movie that the king, it's almost like he would have fears that there will be terrible divisions when he's gone. He wants this sense that everything's going to be beautiful and peaceful after he's gone, with this beautiful, his sons, I'm going about Rand now, but his sons coexisting beautifully, and he wants to see that while he's alive. Now, is that true of the play as well?
Yeah, I to me, it's an open question. And I always wondered, as I was reading this, that the whole setup of that first scene is not so much about dividing the kingdom, some sort of relationship issue between him and Cordelia, and everything else is just theater and an excuse to get Cordelia to say something that he always wanted to hear from her, and he doesn't get it, and so he's so upset and everything. I mean, honestly, the other two daughters, maybe he knows that they're not really true to their word, and they're not, it doesn't strike me as a person who is completely devoid of reason. So why would he do that? I think that it's something to do with his his favorite daughter, his youngest daughter, that is this plain Jane, but is very noble and true and principled, and he wants her to say something that she never has expressed. And when she disappoints him, that pushes him over the edge. And he starts on this, he turns into, like Doug was saying, he transforms and becomes a a kind of Dionysian type of character, who is not easy to reason with. And again, I almost it's hard for me not to turn to the text because it's so great. And the lines here, he starts doing all of this, and he says, because the barbarous Scythian, or he that makes his generation messes to gorge his appetite, shall to my bosom be as well neighbored, pitied, and relieved as thou, my sometime daughter. And of course, the allusion here is to the Scythians, who were kind of the barbarians, but the other allusion is to Esau, right? Esau is the one that's sold his birthright for the mess of pottage, kind of making a bad exchange. But of course, in this text, in this instance, it's Lear that's making a bad exchange. He's exchanging his false daughters for the true one. And then Kent tries to interrupt and says, "Good, my liege." And Lear says, "Peace, Kent, come not between the dragon and his wrath." I mean, I love that line. I mean, that's just such a great line. So eloquent. It's hard to stay away from the text because it's so full of these great lines, picturesque and evocative. Doug, did you want to add something?
Well, yeah, that to make his generation messes, that struck me this morning in a way it never had, that it refers to the gods who eat their own children. The messes are like a mess hall or a food, where in Shakespeare and Titus Andronicus, the eating of children or the baking of children into a pie, and it seems to be a reference to the gods that Zeus and his mother defeated, who were going to eat him and every child they had, and so he turns into an ancient, brutal, devouring god. And there was something I read this morning, a little quote. I didn't do a lot of research on the play, but I stumbled on something that said Lear almost has an incestuous connection with Cordelia. Like he reacts like a jilted lover, not like a father who's empowering his children or his daughter, but he's like romantically
Yeah, that's why doting is such a
betrayed.
good word, right? Doting. He's doting on her. I mean, that is typically used of a young man and a woman.
Right.
As Kent says, I'm not so young as to dote on any woman for anything. And so this word doting is so apropos here. It's
and the other sisters feed that romantic attachment, and I love you all, and
Oh yeah, that's just such a great. I mean, that whole scene is an amazing. I think for theater is probably like the best, right? Playing that. I mean, they're so full of it, so over the top with their, oh, I love you as my breath, and everything. It's just so comedic. I think they're almost making fun of him in some way.
Yeah.
Because they're so over the top. I mean, who could not spot that? It's just, I mean, Kent, Lear's servant, he obviously sees all of that. The sisters themselves say, Dad is really out of it. He can't even tell that we are, he's making all these bad choices. Although those choices are benefiting them, they're still saying these are very bad judgment calls on every front, as he's making them.
Yeah, he's the father that's easily flattered. He's not skeptical and protective of himself and them. He kind of indulges them,
And again, we've seen this with Othello, right? Othello, I had the same kind of issue with him. How can he not see the true character of people that are closest to him? But then we said that Iago was such a great mastermind that perhaps, had we been in Othello's shoes, we would probably fall the same way. Here, we do have masterminds as well, not necessarily in the daughters, but Edmund is a true mastermind. The daughters are more, they're just kind of what's the word, adders, serpents, right? They're just very venomous and conniving and sort of backbiting, and obviously they killed each other in the end, kind of like two snakes that are locked in a jar. They poison, one poisons the other, then the other one stabs or kills herself. So yeah, it's a very interesting setup here.
Yeah, and Iago often uses the word designs, and he really is an artist. He's creating realities that people really believe in.
Mm-hmm.
And so to play these villains, the daughters are a little bit different, but I think in the first scene you have to go, oh, they really love their father, and then you very quickly learn they don't. They're very good at seeming. Seeming is a word that pops up in this scene,
Absolutely. And I was going to say the same thing with just in general, this idea of vision, right? Sight. Things are not what they seem on the surface. And so you have this constant kind of dance between what is on the surface and what is at the core, right? Kent, who is exiled, he takes on a different persona. On the surface, he is one thing. He is just some guy, and Lear can't even tell who he is. But underneath, he is a loyal servant. Edgar becomes, when he is exiled by his father Gloucester, being falsely accused by Edmund, becomes takes on a garb of a madman, and he's this, he looks like a mad person, and he's also kind of disguised, and so you don't see him for what he is, and this constant idea of not seeing things for what they are is, I mean, like, it's everywhere in the play, and it's beautiful to see this constant interplay between what is real and what is on the surface, and it's it's really something to trace through this play. I want to read another passage real quick. Again, in the beginning, just so many favorites here. This is after Lear declares that Cordelia is not going to have any nothing to her name, basically, and King of France still wants to take her as his wife, and this is probably one of the more beautiful lyric passages in the book, or in the play rather. And he says, "Fairest Cordelia, that art most rich being poor, most choice forsaken, and most loved despised. Thee and thy virtues here I seize upon." I mean, just the language is just, I don't know. I'm in love with the language and the beauty of everything. And of course, the last, the last lines in the play, as the finale unfolds before us, probably also very memorable, as everyone dies essentially, and we're left with this pile of bodies. Edgar says, "The weight of the set time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest has borne most. We that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." I mean, again, just very memorable lines. Everybody probably has them memorized. Beautiful, beautiful lines. So I'm curious if anyone else wants to share any of their favorites, by the way. So if you have passages or verses, feel free to quote. There's just so many interesting lines here. And yeah, if you want to add something, just type in an exclamation point in the chat. I'll be happy to give you the floor. I guess, the other thing I wanted to mention is the parallels with Oedipus here. Just like in Oedipus, you have this idea of limitation of knowledge and what comes with it. And also in Oedipus, you have Theseus, the seer, who is blinded physically, and yet he sees what is really happening. And here we have this idea of sight is constantly brought up, and you have Gloucester, who starts out being blind, not physically, but mentally and emotionally and every other way. And finally he loses his eyesight and his eyes are put out. But then he is reunited with his son, his true son, Edgar. And there's some measure, I think, of redemption in the story as well, both on in terms of Gloucester and Edgar, and also Cordelia and King Lear. Obviously, all end up very badly, but there is that element of yet another reversal of fate in some way. So in some ways, they're reconciled and they find peace and reconciliation with those who were closest to them and whom they had misjudged. So in that sense, there is some of that kind of positive reversal, even though their fortunes are mostly lost at that point. So anyway, yeah, any more thoughts or comments on that, Doug?
About what specifically? About the
just anything in general on the play, and maybe just the idea of reversals in the play as well, something that is peripeteias that are so common.
Yeah, I did have something to say about that, because in the first scene he talks about, you're not going to get me to change my vows. Well, almost every Shakespeare play, a character makes a vow in the first scene, and 2 pages later situations force them to break the vow. But he doesn't. He's old school. I've made this vow and I'm the king and I'm going to do this. And so the danger of vows made and broken, I mean, Shakespeare to a great degree is a dance of vows made and broken, where like Much Ado, even in the comedy, Beatrice and Benedict hate each other, but they end up loving each other by the end of the play through a range of simulations and different things. They finally agree to it. So that idea of this swearing off marriage or swearing off your daughter and then forced by circumstance, but it takes, instead of being asked to, he's asked to change his vow by Kent, but he says, no, I'm not going to. But 4 acts later, he has to change his vow. I had one Shakespeare teacher who actually really well known and even in British circles, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the how thing, which he had an interesting interpretation. I think he may have seen it played this way. He'd seen so many American, British, Canadian actors tackle the classic that he could describe all the different ways different actors did it. And he said one actor, or maybe it was his interpretation, was that too was a military command, that he's carrying the body and he's ordering the crowd to howl. It's never played that way. It's like, oh, like it's a Greek wailing. But if it's a military order, it's a whole different thing, that even as he's lost what's most precious to him, he's still ordering people around and blaming others in a way. So I don't know. There are constant reversals. They're savage, and the language in the beginning, I realized subtly with his daughter, with Cordelia, there's a lot of dripping cruelty in the way he talks to her, and it's sort of the tone of that. Every time you read it, it becomes richer. It's like impenetrable almost the first time you read it. And I had one other comment, because you were talking about the language and the English. George Bernard Shaw did not like Shakespeare. He thought he was a mediocre thinker and that he was not a great playwright. And he thought he himself and other people were better thinkers and playwrights. But he said Shakespeare was the greatest musician in the English language, and he compared his musical effects to Mozart and Beethoven. And that he said what his plays and Ibsen's plays would be dead as dirt, his plays would be fresh as paint, because the language in them. And I've seen audiences laugh at things that I know they don't understand the joke, literally, rationally, but there's something in the music of the line that is funny and they laugh. I mean, so there's comedy has a sort of music to it. And he has this, yeah, that's all I would say. That I think the musical and his ability to put words next to each other that don't belong next to each other. They're just his ability to create contrasts within a phrase, you know, hot ice, strange snow, uh, you know, his ability to sort of juxtapose things. He goes through so many different tones, but that's where you just have to sink into it. In some ways, read it out loud. And when we were working with the junior high school girls, once we got them to understand how the words tasted on the tongue, I found them outside the classroom after we dismissed them, and they were sitting on the lawn saying it back and forth to each other because it was fun to put Shakespeare's language on their tongues. And so like they were chanting nursery rhymes or rap tunes. They were suddenly like chanting this stuff back and forth to each other. And that's not something I think actors always master, the complete truth of the language and the musical brilliance of the language and its ability to change tone and turn on a dime. People will moan through a whole monologue, but Shakespeare is going through 30 different mood changes in the course of a monologue through the language itself.
Mm.
And I think Shaw's really right about that his musical effects are astonishing, but you really have to relax to sort of begin to approach that and be very playful with it. And Lear goes from being impenetrable to being, that scene in the hovel with, the mad Tom who's impersonating madness and the fool and Lear who are kind of going mad. And Kent, right? Kent's the other character in there, right?
Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or
at some
does
point he
Kent show
joined
up later? I can't remember there. Oh, another beggar. It's a beggar, I think, who owns the hovel or something. I haven't read that scene in a while. Do you remember who's in that scene in the hovel? And they do a trial. They do a mock trial.
Yeah, no, I do remember that scene. I just don't remember who's all in there. I think Kent is either there or he's like on his way somewhere. He's always kind of in and out as well.
Yeah, he may be coming in and out of that
Yeah,
scene, actually.
yeah. All right. Paul, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I love this idea of the musicality of it, because when you described the one actor that interpreted the how differently, it kind of reminded me of in the American standards jazz tradition, how the great vocalists, you have to have some really good raw material, but then Carmen McRae would sing the same line with this different emphasis and the melody a little different twist, but the basic raw material, the power of the standard, like a song like There Will Never Be Another You or A Million You Could Pick. And then how the vocalist then has this real chance to make that their own or bring something out, a color. But there has to be this raw material there. And you're saying to me that Shakespeare provided that raw material that would allow an actor to bring out a color. And each one could be different. I love that. Or that's how I interpreted or understood what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's the way different musicians do play music, different actors tackle different. Oddly, Richard Chamberlain, who was known to play Dr. Kildare and was almost a soap opera actor, did a beautiful Richard too. And it's because he really had somehow learned to master the language, but also make it appear absolutely real. And I think that's the influence of the Italian comedians who were known to be very, very funny, but almost hyper real. There was a realism to the Italian comics that influenced Molière and Shakespeare. So there's this sort of, and Dickens captures that too. He's like almost a journalistic writer writing fairy tales, you know. He has a journalistic eye and the eye of a legal reporter, which he was, but he's writing fairy tales. He's using that mind to write fairy tales. And that's very, I think Dickens borrows a lot of that from Shakespeare. And Shaw used to say that Dickens would write in iambic pentameter, Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter, but Dickens and Shaw himself would write in iambic pentameter, but they'd hide it in paragraphs so the actors wouldn't get too poetic with it. Shaw wanted actors to be very direct with the language, but the rhythm of it was like a drum beat in some of his great speeches in St.
Oh
John.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And we
Yeah.
have a lot of really great monologues here as well in this play. So there's the monologue of Edgar talking about his plight as Edmund talking about his plight as a illegitimate bastard. And this whole he starts this whole like dissection of the language, right? He starts playing on this baseness. What's the base? Why am I base? What bastard, base, this whole idea of the word sounding the same, right? And the meanings being close together as well, tells you that Shakespeare is, he's fully aware of, the wordplay that he is employing. And then it's really, something that he is using to the fullest degree possible. But with that, I have a question for all of you as native English speakers. What do you think is happening as we move further and further away from the King James era and the language of the times? I mean, it's already hard for us to read Shakespeare today with so many words that are no longer used. What's going to happen as the language keeps changing and the meanings become more and more obscure? Do you think some of that potency is going to be lost? I mean, this is kind of a rhetorical question, I guess, but not fully so. So I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on that. Paul, did you want to tackle that?
Well, I just want to say I wouldn't worry too much, Phil, because it already happened. I mean, I'm old, and when I was a kid, that language was obscure. So I don't think it's like the degree of further deviation compared to where it already was isn't that huge. That's my quick thought to it.
That was my intuition as well, actually. So I wanted to confirm that before I said it. Yeah, that was my intuition too, is that exactly that, is that we're so far from that now that whatever changes are happening today are probably minuscule. But I do have to say that sometimes, I have to sit with a dictionary and go back to, some of these words to try to understand what exactly, some of these are familiar to those who have read the Bible, the King James Bible, because it's the same exact, use of language, and with all the methinks and prithee and so on. But some of it is really obscure. And even commentators say that some of the language that's used by Shakespeare, he uses words in ways that have not been used before, and maybe even invents new words that sometimes I'm not even sure what the word means. So a lot of interesting kind of mysterious passages here that, especially, I don't know, Doug, have you noticed, like when you read the Fool's lines, some of them are pretty hard to understand. I mean, he's doing some sort of.
Oh yeah, they're very obscure.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about this is that I think English classes and college classes have destroyed Shakespeare because they kind of get people to approach it from the rational mind and not the music. And so I think we've been trained away from what is the real power of the language, and that it's a test of whether you're smart or not, whether you understand Shakespeare. But having produced a number of productions of Shakespeare, directed a few, acted in some, you realize that kids mainline Shakespeare. They go into the source of it, and adults are spending, or even working class audiences, in the first scenes of Shakespeare, while the college educated crowd is still trying to get used to the language, a working class audience can smell that somebody's going to get screwed and somebody's going to get killed and this blood is going to be spilled. They smell it just in the logic of the scene and the staging. And you can hear a working class audience go, whoa, when a college educated audience is still scratching their chins trying to figure out what they're talking about. And I gave an assignment to an acting class for the actors to write a sonnet. And so this guy who was a businessman was with his girlfriend, and he decided, oh, well, I'm going to study Shakespeare. So he watched Midsummer Night's Dream, a movie, and he and his girlfriend couldn't figure out what was going on. And her 4-year-old daughter explained the whole thing to them. He said, there's a potion, they take it and it makes people fall in love. And then they, and they're in love with the wrong people. And the adults are, again, chin stroking while the kid is just mainlining what's going on. And kids are not afraid of words they don't understand. They don't understand half of what we talk about. Whereas adults, if they don't understand something, they think it's wrong or it's stupid or it's bad. Or it's there to shame me. But kids, half of what we do totally baffles kids, and they're used to that. And so they come to Shakespeare with a curiosity for these strange words that people are using. And I've seen people, there are teachers who've worked with Shakespeare and a few movies about this, working with Shakespeare with elementary school children. And boy, they get to play with a sword, they get to kill somebody, they get to die, they get to fall in love. I mean, elementary school children just eat it up. So, and also around the world, I think Shakespeare, maybe because it's in other languages, although you look at India, you look at some countries in Africa, their English is a very powerful language, and Shakespeare, like Neruda loves Shakespeare, but a lot of people here in our country, oh, he's an old white guy, we got to ignore them. But around the world, Shakespeare is seen just like Tolstoy or just like Dickens, as a great storyteller. And maybe it's because it's translated for them. But amazing Romeo and Juliet I saw from Rhodesia, and it was directed by a guy who'd been a martial artist, and he suddenly saw a theater rehearsing in the cultural center, and he got addicted to theater and came to New York, and it was astonishing African version of Romeo and Juliet that was just mind-blowingly good, and a musical version of it. So it's, even in Central America and Latin America, South America, Mexico, even, in a way, they're more literate European influenced cultures than North America, where we throw things away, until maybe Baz Luhrmann does Romeo and Juliet, and then we can like it for a little while, But it's a tricky one. It's weird to see the effect it has on a naive crowd. But yeah, the language is tricky. Yeah, it's.
I mean, I like it. I like it a lot because I'm detail oriented, and so I'll dive in and start doing these word studies. But it's interesting to see you mention this mainlining idea where you just try to get the feel for it without getting into the weeds. And you probably could read most of King Lear with that kind of with that as your modus operandi and get a lot from it. And when you read The Fool, you kind of get what he's trying to do. I mean, he's basically trying to combine the things that don't combine to sort of create this painting of what Lear is like, what he's doing. He's an old man who acts like a child. He's combining things that, like you mentioned, that should not be combined or ordinarily are not, and creates these sort of paradoxical pairs of things that don't make sense because Lear doesn't make sense. And so yeah, but then you have Edgar, who takes that to the next level with being this madman, and that's a whole level of madness there. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on him as a character while he is pretending to be mad.
It reminds me of a strange story. A great Cuban writer, a woman, Irene Fornes, very small woman from Cuba, and she lived in New York, great playwright and a great teacher. Madness is a kind of protective shell. And she found that when she was walking down a street in New York, and this is when New York was really dangerous, and she lived there for most of the last half of the 20th century, uh, she would start to impersonate a mad woman, and guys who seemed to be coming at her would cross the street to avoid her because nobody wants to deal with a mad person. So in a way, he's putting a protective shell around himself by becoming this mad person.
Absolutely.
So it's yeah, and it's heartbreaking because he's playing mad while he's watching King Lear go mad. It's a
Yes.
very it's there is a realism to this that is really hard to find, and that's where it's convincing. And I think even iambic pentameter, because the poetry above that was 4 beats to a line, and it was very regular, ba boom, 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 and maybe 4 beats and 3 beats and 4 beats and 3 beats, and it was sort of sing song. When you add the 5th beat, it actually decenters the line and becomes very affected in 19th century singing of Shakespeare. But if you really look at the 5 beat line, it decenters the English line, much the way Brubeck's Take Five changes music,
Mm.
possibilities forever. That sort of three, that ability, you can stress 1 beat and 4 beats, 2 beats and 3 beats, 3 beats and 2 beats, 4 beats and 1 beat. I mean, it's actually a tool to make poetry very real, very direct, and
Mm.
reflect street language and natural language, but most people don't approach it that way.
Well,
So I
that's
think
really interesting. Yeah, I never heard of that as a. So
I'm not sure I've heard it anywhere, but I think I was addicted to Take Five, the Brubeck album, for a while, and I kept thinking, oh, this is like Shakespeare. It's like,
right. Yeah, so there's certain imbalance and also dynamism at the same time in each line, because it's like you're teetering on the edge of something, and then you have the next line and you're teetering again, and then you kind of end.
right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And Marlowe uses it. They called it a mighty line, and Milton used it another way and for other effects. But even Milton starts to get into some real, almost sci-fi energies in some parts of Paradise Lost, where it's really quite wild what he's doing with the line. But Shakespeare is a genuine musician, I think, and George Bernard Shaw kind of convinced me of that. And I think we've only begun to scratch the surface. He's also dealing with a lot of mystical things, and there's books about a guy who became a Zen student in a prison of war camp in Japan, and he was English or American, and he's written a book about English literature and Zen thought. And I've always thought when you read a lot of that Zen thinking and the Gita and different mystical writings, and then you reread Shakespeare, you realize there's a lot of mystical kind of energy going on in the lines that it's hard to describe until but that book actually tracks it down. He studied Zen Buddhism while he was in prison in Japan, and then he began to apply that to English literature. And I think there are 4 volumes to this book, Zen and English literature. I'll try to find it. And I think Lear is just full of that energy, of it's like a way of nothingness, which is a very dangerous way to meditate. I've learned that, where you just focus on nothing, which is a very important principle in mysticism. But unless you're trained by somebody, it can dislocate you, as Lear is dislocated. He's torn away from everything he knows and all the respect he's gotten, and he just unravels, you know. And it's like that mystical journey of dismantling the ego to find something else. And I think he does. The gentleness and the fragility of the poetry in the last scenes between him and Cordelia is so excruciatingly beautiful when an actor knows how to just let it play itself. It's like is so tender, that he finally becomes a human being by the end of the play, and then he loses everything, including his life. But it's like
yeah. Paul, did you?
Hamlet has a lot of that too. Flights of Angels,
Mhm.
that ability to finally rest
Mm.
and stillness, and it's what Richard Chamberlain did with the end of Richard II when he was in prison, and I saw it at the Amundsen in LA. And when he was in prison and staring at the mirror, which he finally breaks, it was so simple, but it's like he figured it all out too late to actually be a decent king. He actually figured it out too late to really make use of it.
Right. Well, part of the tragic setup, right? Yeah. Mhm. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really inspired by this. All the musical analogies that you just continued with the Brubeck thing. I heard a jazz educator recently who I really admire talk about how the songs you're talking about, they were the music schools were teaching things, in his opinion, wrongly until maybe the late 80s or 90s, because the masters of these songs, including Brubeck and guys, would go, oh, all those 19 chords that Charlie Parker was playing in that, that's like just a little progression. That's just the blues. It's just this and then that and then this. There's a beginning, a middle, end. And they wouldn't hold back to the big picture. And all the students would be memorizing these modes and these complicated scales. And it reminds me of how people study Shakespeare, maybe the wrong way to study Shakespeare. And you guys talk about the big sweep. The kid sees the kid who mainlines, oh, there's the potion, there's the people who fell in love wrong. So it's a very good analogy of how you can get so lost in the technicalities that you just got to back up to the big picture to really appreciate these art forms, including Shakespeare and Take Five in a way. Yeah, that's just thoughts. Thanks for
Like,
take that further and really look into that.
yeah, it's like what I heard about how what people say about reading the Bible. A child can swim in it and an elephant can drown in it. And Shakespeare is the same way, where a child can understand it, but sometimes adults can drown in it in all the, it's too overwhelming. But there are so many different levels, right? A child will understand it on one level, but as adults we can understand it on multiple levels, including hopefully the simple, right, the most obvious level that perhaps sometimes we miss. Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else who wants to contribute to the discussion or maybe share some of your favorite passages from King Lear? I think the text, speaks for itself so beautifully. It's almost like I feel totally superfluous talking about it when we have the text in front of us that is so rich with so much. I mean, it's just I just want to keep reading and rereading certain passages that are so sticky from Lear. We have so many great quotations that come out of it. Anyone else who wants to contribute, just type an exclamation point, raise your hand, whichever works. Okay. I do want to mention one thing. So when I was doing some background reading on this, so apparently Shakespeare had some historical sources that he used to base the play on, which is very interesting. So it's possible that this story has some actual historical precedent, and then Shakespeare, as we know, used a lot of historical incidents to base his plays on, including Rome and mythology and so on. So this is definitely in that vein, but of course he adds so much depth and psychological innovation here probably the same way that Euripides takes kind of the stock story of Medea and then adds this whole new level of understanding of what's going on, plus adding this feature of her killing her progeny. Here we of course have also plots or subplots that are not part of the historical manuscripts that we do have, that Shakespeare possibly based the story on. But anyway, just thought I'd mention it because it is maybe a lesser known feature of this play. All right, well, since if there are no other comments or contributions, I guess, Doug, do you want to say any sort of parting words, some final observations or anything like that?
Well, I think the sweep of it where Mad Tom finally shows up as the warrior, and the then poisonings and counter poisonings and self poisonings, and it's even hard to remember all of who killed who and why and what happens at the end. But there's sort of this cataclysm of things, and then the blinding, of Gloucester, and that his son finds him on a sea cliff and impersonates another character. He's no longer Mad Tom. He's just trying to help this old man, and then simulates a falling off the cliff. And then that is a kind of almost like a Zen whack, that when Gloucester doesn't die from his blind fall from the cliff, he sort of surrenders to life in a different way. There is it's a lot of a lot of people have been posting on Sisyphus lately, some artwork in my neighborhood, that people seem to be working with the theme of Sisyphus without working on it. But that idea of pushing a boulder and pushing a boulder, and then you don't. I mean, there are these impossible tasks in Lear, and then through lack of energy, age, exhaustion, they just stop. And then a very strange peace descends on the play. I mean, that effort and no effort. And that's why I think some of the Zen things, there's more of that in English literature going back to the medieval period than we think. And sometimes reading something like the Gita or Zen texts, they illuminate Shakespeare in ways, and you go, oh my gosh, that's a real Zen moment that a character's having, where they kind of can't believe what they're seeing. Their senses are showing them something horrific, like in Titus Andronicus. So it's so it's sort of like the odd, I mean, I read this play for decades and I couldn't make, Bob, why don't you talk? I'm running out of gas. I couldn't make sense of it. And then suddenly I went, oh my gosh, this is so simple. That's why I couldn't make sense of it. It's so.
I'm trying to, I have a certain impression about what you guys have been talking about, or the play itself, that it seems to be contrary to another kind of view that we aim for, and that is, I think of the theme of growing, gaining knowledge, self-improvement, and this is such a strong theme in some areas, and so I have to ask the question: Is Lear a play about the exact opposite? That is, you start with a reality, and you look at the consequences of ignorance, of what happens when you are doing the opposite of self-improvement. It's a play about the consequences, and I don't know why I think of this, but think of war itself, the wars that are going on right now. I mean, one with Ukraine and the other with Israel. These are themes of ignorance. I mean, somebody is stupid here and is creating a lot of destruction. That's what war does. for nothing. I mean, do I have the right parallel here? Is that why Lear is so important?
Yeah,
Well, yeah, go
I
ahead,
think
Doug.
that's a very good insight.
Yeah,
Go
me,
ahead.
yeah,
Phil.
me too. I was, yeah, that's a great way to sum it up, Bob. I think that's a great way to, if there's one theme there, it's this lack of wisdom. I mean, I like the word wisdom more than self-improvement because it has that nice ring to it, kind of but yeah, I mean, that's what the fool says to Lear. You've gotten old, but you haven't gotten wise. And that's his biggest injunction against him. As we expect people to get wiser as they get older, and when only one happens but not the other, to him that's unnatural. I think Shakespeare has this. I think Shakespeare's big on nature, and things that are unnatural he kind of despises. Um, and yeah, and so when it's unnatural for a man to be old but not wise, and Lear is in that position, but he has another problem. He is in a position of authority. So it's one thing to be old, but nobody counts on you. But if you're in a position of authority, as he is, then it becomes deadly because he has to, he makes all sorts of decisions that affect, hundreds of people. And now his whole kingdom is in disarray, is in a state of war. So I think that's a good analogy because they are at war, right? They end up being literally at war with one another, and then his daughters destroy themselves, literally kill each other. All of his daughters are gone. Yeah, it's pretty consequences of ignorance and being unwise is probably the theme. Doug, do
Yeah,
you want to
Bob.
add anything to that?
Yeah, Bob, I think that's a very good point to say what is a play of self-improvement, and oddly, even though everybody's dead at the end, I think Hamlet is, other than a few key people, but Hamlet is a play of self-improvement. The time is out of joint, oh cursed spite, that I was born to set it right. And he does set it right. He purges the land of this evil uncle he has.
Mm.
And it is a kind of, there's a progress, but Lear is the opposite of that. Lear is just when when things fall apart, they just keep falling. And I had one friend who said, with King Lear, when you think you've hit bottom, look down because you haven't, there's another depth that you can fall. And
That's probably a very Russian proverb.
very Russian problem.
There's never a bottom. There's just no bottom. Finding
There's
bottoms.
just down, down, down. But I
Yes.
think that's a really interesting idea in Lear. I'm trying to think who's left. Even Kent feels like he's going to follow very soon after, and maybe that's
But Kent is a great antidote to this foolishness, and he is
yeah,
probably if there's a character that you can admire in this play, it's Kent. He is a true servant who is steadfast. He is what Lear should have been. He is
yeah,
exactly what Lear should have been. He is kind of this middle-aged man who pretty much is ready to sacrifice himself for his loyalty to a person who really doesn't deserve it, to be honest. But he's still loyal to him, even in the face of betrayal and everything else. So yeah, kind of an amazing character.
and the King of France is a positive character, and that Edgar survives after all the tribulation he goes through. I think there is a hope at the end of the play that this nonsense has been purged and that people have
Yeah.
learned something
Mhm.
and that they're very humbled by it. I mean, it's a really humbling ending of the play.
Yeah. What do you think about the line where he says, "We shall not live so long"? Does he say it figuratively or literally? In other words, we will not experience life in the same fullness as these ones that have gone before us. That last, that
The
very last.
oldest hath borne most, we that are young shall never see so much nor live so long. And that's said by Edgar,
Yeah.
which is interesting. If he's the leader of the future, he's very humbled by
Mhm.
what he's seen and this catastrophe that his elders have brought on themselves.
I don't know, this is but let me just mention this. So when I was
Oh, the lines before it, just to say that, and hold that. The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say, which is a big journey from the opening scene, where everybody's saying what they ought to say, except
right,
Cordelia.
except
Go
for
ahead. What were you going to say, Phil?
I was gonna say, so I recall when I was in my early days attending a Bible school, we were studying Proverbs. And one of the things about Proverbs is you have 3 stages of wisdom. One is the first stage is where everybody starts out. So there's no rebuke at that point because everybody starts out as a fool. We're all born into this life fools because we're ignorant. But then there's the divide. And the divide is, are you going to learn and get rid of that foolishness and become a wise person? So that's one route. And then the second route is the clock is going to keep ticking, but you're going to stay a fool in that you're not going to learn from your mistakes, essentially, which is what Proverbs is all about. It's about teaching you how not to behave so that you don't get particular bad consequences of that bad behavior. So a person who is a fool refuses to listen to instruction, and he becomes then not just a fool, but he becomes, well, I really should say that you start as a simpleton, you become a fool when you are hardened in that simplicity and ignorance. But a wise person is essentially a person who listens to the instruction and then becomes a wiser character. So in Lear, we have this person who refuses, not only is he ignorant, but he refuses to listen to good counsel. So Kent and everyone around him is trying to tell him, look, don't do this. This is a terrible idea. But he refuses, and there he goes. Of course, we have other characters like the Gloucester, really unclear why he is so in love with his illegitimate son, perhaps because of some attachment to the mother of that son or something like that, which again could be this theme of doting, right? Doting, and his legitimate son Edmund is really the one that he should be esteeming much higher. Anyway, yeah, so those are probably some final thoughts, yeah, go ahead, Doug.
I had one other, that I think these villains in Shakespeare, after working on a number of different plays, I think they're there to make the good people smarter, because it's not good enough to be good. You also have to be smart. And it shows up in the Bible in a couple of places where it says you have to be clever as a fox or clever as a snake to be gentle as a dove. And so Iago and all these characters, they're kind of teaching the good people who just think it's good and it's going to be good and everything's going to be fine. It's like, no, you got to keep your eye on that shadow side, that thing over there that's trying to just destroy it. And there is that building, the point that Bob made, I think made me think that in these Eastern and even in Western and in Aristotle, there's the birth and the beginning, there's the sustaining of an energy, and then there's the decline and fall of the energy, which then often leads to a new birth. But there's that. So yeah, I mean, Lear is definitely heavy on the dissolution, the fragmentation, and the horror of.
Yeah.
Did
Yes,
you catch the hysteria moment, the mother, where he talks about the mother rising up in him, which is connected to hysteria, in that scene where he's facing his daughter, and Lear talks about this mother rising in his body, which is somehow, I can't remember it. There's so much in the play that it's like there's this reference to this emotion that just rises up in him and almost chokes him while he's trying to confront his daughters, or one of his daughters.
Yeah, Katie just posted in the chat about lack of foresight. Yeah, Katie, I totally agree. Definitely lack of foresight on the part of all these main characters. But also, interestingly, kind of the lack of just learning from the past, right? I mean, Lear presumably should have known better, having raised his daughters, again, presumably, but we don't know.
That jumped out at me that the daughters at the end of that first scene say he never did know himself very well.
Yeah, that's another great line.
It's
Yes,
a really interesting, I can't
another
remember the
great line
exact line, but it was like, he just has no clue about the movie he's in, which is what young girls said in the 80s a lot. What movie are you in? And Lear's definitely in a movie, of his
Yeah.
own making,
Boy, this chock full of these great lines there.
Yeah, no, it's amazing language.
All right. Well, I think if there are no more additions or comments, we'll call it a night. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Another great discussion. And next time we're doing Hamlet, so come back for that. And we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
That's in 2 weeks. Yeah, okay. I'll try to put that in my calendar. All right.